In the State of American Business Address, we heard loud and clear that it is critical for the United States to compete on a global scale. Technological innovation is one of the key ingredients to ensure America has the tools to lead. From the internet revolution to wireless connectivity infrastructure like 5G, the nation that leads in innovation is best positioned to lead the world for the coming decades. Perhaps the most critical technology for the U.S. to maintain leadership in is artificial intelligence. AI is already contributing to growth, from developing vaccines for COVID-19 to promoting economic inclusion through the use of inclusion scores and expanding access to credit. But at the same time, many challenges are ahead. Last month, CTEC commissioned a poll by Teneo that found that more than 80% of Americans agree that the United States is best positioned to lead in developing an ethical framework for AI, and it is the nation that should lead in AI. We agree. And it is for that reason that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Technology Engagement Center today announces the formation and launch of a new commission on AI competitiveness, inclusion, and innovation to develop lasting recommendations to lead the AI race. Our commission will be co-chaired by former Congressman John Delaney of Maryland and Mike Ferguson of New Jersey. And both will bring together with a larger commission, a diverse group of commissioners that will work to develop durable, bipartisan policy solutions in the area of AI. I want to thank both you, Congressman Delaney and Congressman Ferguson, for joining us today and for your leadership. And let's get right into it. We've seen a lot in pop culture of how AI is manifested in robots and androids. We've also seen commercials about companies using AI to solve business problems. We're seeing a lot of different applications in health, finance, and public safety for AI. With so many different conceptions of what AI is, how do we define AI, and why is that so important? Maybe I'll kick that off to Congressman Delaney.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm very excited about the commission. I'm very excited to work with Mike and to work with the chamber on this incredibly important work. I mean, artificial intelligence is fundamentally reshaping our economic systems, our social systems, and I think increasingly our environmental systems. Put differently, it's kind of reshaping and reimagining every aspect of our society. And I think we're going to have to start thinking about artificial intelligence differently. It's not a discrete kind of technological component in the corner. It is actually kind of animating through, machine learning and computing power, and broadly artificial intelligence is kind of animating every aspect of our life. And like most technological innovation, it has the opportunity to be profoundly positive. And I think some of the examples you've mentioned, and there are many others, are a great example of that. But that's kind of how I think about it. I think about it as the smart technology that is enabling all aspects of our society and reimagining all aspects of our society ultimately has the opportunity to be extraordinarily positive, like innovation has always been. But it's a two-way street. And there are things we have to be thinking about from a policy perspective or a regulatory perspective to ensure that it benefits as many people as possible, and that inherent biases that exist in our society do not get effectively embedded in these new systems that will be part and parcel of every interaction we have in kind of a commercial context. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. It's so fundamentally important that we get definitions right, because we have to get those right in order to tackle the policy areas that this commission is looking at addressing. And Congressman Ferguson, what are some of the key issues that the commission hopes to tackle?
Well, first, thanks again for having me. I'm delighted to be a co-chair of the commission. And Congressman Delaney has been a leader on these issues for a long time, and it's really a pleasure to get to work with him now in our post-congressional lives. I'm really excited about the commission. I think there are really three areas that the commission needs to focus on, and I think can have a real impact on. First is how do we compete globally when it comes to artificial intelligence? Second, how do we regulate fairly when it comes to government policy or other policy? And third, how do we prepare our workforce for the future when it comes to how artificial intelligence is going to impact our economy and impact the jobs of people in our country going forward? And, I think the commission is going to get into, I hope, all of these issues. We're going to travel around the country and hear from a diverse group of stakeholders, people who care about these issues, who are experts in these issues. We're going to have field hearings around the country. We're going to kick it off in Austin, Texas in March. And, I'm hoping that we're going to hear from consumer groups and civil rights groups, from industry and academia. And as we get into some of these issues, I think it's going to be really important to hear from the stakeholders and to be able to digest some of that information and some of that feedback. When it comes to global competition, there's, I think the country that best embraces the ethical use of artificial intelligence is really going to be the leader and to be best positioned economically going into the future. I think it's those countries that are going to have the most benefit. And I think this commission can really, I hope, will help position the United States to be that leader and to be best positioned to benefit from artificial intelligence. It's when I talk about regulating fairly, as a Republican, lots of folks in my party, including me, sometimes look with skepticism at government regulation. So many government regulations sometimes really serve to stifle innovation and stifle investment in new technology rather than helping to encourage it. But the flip side of that is some regulations are really important to help provide certainty, to help provide a framework for industry to have transparency and to be able to make new investments and new innovations with confidence that the government's not going to come and change the rules on them or punish them somehow. So having that regulatory framework in a fair way is really important, and I think that's going to be really important when it comes to artificial intelligence. And when it comes to our workforce, there are a lot of challenges in our workforce today. There's a lot of uncertainty, and as technology advances in our economy and the nature of jobs change, I think it's going to be really important to make sure that artificial intelligence and the advances that it brings and the advantages that it brings doesn't serve the other purpose of leaving some people behind. I think we have to make sure that we are preparing our workforce, investing in our workforce to make sure that artificial intelligence really benefits everybody.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, Congressman Ferguson, about how this commission is going to really go out and try to get input from different stakeholders and different members of the community across the country, whether it's civil rights groups, whether it's the business community. And on that first meeting on March 10th in Austin at the Austin Chamber, I think we're going to get our first taste of really getting a chance to see what the public has to think about artificial intelligence. Speaking of convening, though, Representative Delaney, you were the founding member of the AI caucus on Capitol Hill and were the lead sponsor of the Future of AI Act in the House. What sparked your interest in AI policy?
Well, it struck me, and again, as someone who came from the private sector prior to serving and having the privilege of serving in government, it struck me that one of the things that government was lagging in was thinking about the future. And that's something that the private economy actually does quite well, which is to think about the future, think about where the world is going, and steer your business to hopefully be successful in that new world. And that was sorely lacking in government. And in many ways, when you would go into the private sector, all they were talking about is how kind of the technological transition towards a future where AI, machine learning, and other advanced computing technologies were reshaping their industry, and they were preparing for it. And none of that was happening in government. And it struck me as one of the most important things for us to be doing, yet we were doing none of it. And I think we've seen examples of that when technology companies or social media companies would come and testify in Congress, And it felt like the members of Congress were poorly equipped to even engage in the traditional kind of dialogue, which leads to the policy making that they have to do. So that was the insight behind the AI caucus, which was to create an opportunity to convene leaders from the private sector, from public policy, from different stakeholders who are thinking about this for their communities, and to convene those groups and have that discussion in the Congress. And I think to some extent, that's why I'm so excited to be part of the commission, co-chair of the commission with Mike. And I'm excited for our first event in Austin, because I think it's a continuation of that work, because that's what we're really going to be doing. We're going to be listening, and we're going to be kind of digesting the inputs from all these different stakeholders, obviously the private sector, policymakers, people from government, a diverse group of people with different perspectives of how these technologies are impacting the communities that they care about, and coming up with recommendations, because it's critically important that the United States lead in artificial intelligence. And we come from this with such a position of strength. If you think about our innovation economy and how successful our government has historically been in partnering with our world-class universities and with the private sector in leading on innovation. The United States still, by any measure, at least in my judgment, is the leading innovation economy because of the rule of law that we have in this country and the fundamental freedoms that we have in this country. Those are kind of irreplaceable assets. However, other countries, particularly China, are making massive disproportionate investments. They have certain advantages that we don't want to have, right? You know, they don't have privacy restrictions, and that's actually an advantage when you're trying to develop artificial intelligence capabilities. We don't actually want to compete on that, obviously. In my judgment, we need more privacy restrictions in this country. But we have to make sure that the United States has all the key tools and the environment it needs to be successful. We have to make sure our companies are competitive. We have to make sure the government's playing the appropriate role it needs to play, which is making investments in areas that the private sector fundamentally will never invest in because the return time frame is too long. And also that policymakers are thinking about kind of some of the things that Mike touched on, which is, you know, the guardrails that we need to make sure that, you know, importantly, some of the biases that we have in our society that we're working hard to eliminate in our society, that those don't get hardwired into the systems that will be making decisions in the future that impact so many of our lives. So there's privacy implications, there's inherent bias implications that need to be considered by policymakers, so that we can kind of unleash the power of our innovation economy against advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, continue to lead the world in innovation, continue to produce the businesses that are the global leaders. All of that is fundamentally good for our economy, but do it in a way that safeguards the fundamental liberties and rights of our citizens. So, you know, that's what the AI caucus was about. And to some extent, this commission, one of the reasons I'm excited about it is an opportunity to continue that work, partnering with the chamber and Mike.
Congressman Delaney, you're singing my tune about the need for a national privacy law. So I appreciate that. You know, you did mention China a little bit, and China is heavily investing in artificial intelligence. They put forward a plan highlighting their ambitions to become the world leader by 2030. Before the commission convenes, and I'll throw this question to both of you, Congressman Delaney and Congressman Ferguson, what are your thoughts on how the United States should lead?
Well, I guess I would just say that, you know, we are living in an increasingly competitive world. We are facing both economic and other geopolitical threats from competitors. And we see that in hostile actions taken by countries that are not necessarily our friends or our allies. And that's a real challenge for us. And it's a particular challenge when our country is somewhat divided, so to speak, on a number of different things, whether it's politics or culture or other things. So obviously, the more that we can work together in our country, the better off we'll be. But we also need to be able to recognize the competitive threats that are out there. And clearly, China, as you mentioned, wants to be the world dominator in every way. So it's going to be very, very important for us to be able to compete globally. And that's why I said earlier, when you talk about the some of the main priorities of our commission, one of them has to be and will be, how do we compete globally on the global stage? And artificial intelligence is going to be a huge part of the future economic development of our world. And America has to be positioned to be a leader on that, or we will be left behind. And that will have a lot of negative implications in some ways certainly that we can't even think of at this point.
And I would agree with everything Mike just said there. And I would also add the fact that if you look at where you get the best economic outcomes, whether it's in a small town or in a country, the best economic outcomes occur when the private sector and the government work well together. When you see fighting between the private economy and the government, you don't get good economic outcomes. But when you see collaboration and cooperation, and when you see them working against the same set of goals, you see fabulous economic outcomes. And I think ultimately, for the United States to be the leader in the advanced economy that is being built now around the world, which includes artificial intelligence, clearly, we have to play to our strengths. And our greatest strengths is that we're an entrepreneurial and innovative country. It's kind of in our DNA as a nation. And we have a governmental system, a rule of law, this kind of liberal democracy, if you will, that is critical to fostering innovation. In other words, if you look at how our education system, our K-12 education system is increasingly lagging the world, you don't necessarily see that in the university level, where the American universities remain kind of the leading, particularly in engineering and technology. And I think the reason for that is because the best minds and the best thinkers will only work in a true democracy, right, where they have freedom of expression and where they have the ability to have ownership in their intellectual creations. And that's our great strength at the end of the day. And we have to be very much aligned around that as a government and as a private economy to make sure we're continuing to make the investments, creating the policy framework that allows companies to make the investments, have the government make the investments that they need to make, and that we have a policy framework where this can unfold, as Mike said, in an ethical manner, because the winner will be the country that gets this right, because there are very serious implications. And I think that's got to be our goal. And I think if we do that, there's no reason to believe we cannot win in this, like we've won in every other kind of economic wave that's occurred. So that's how I think about it. I mean, think about our core strengths, play to them, make sure they're supported, and get back to that spirit of collaboration and cooperation. Now, as Mike also said, we're in a tough spot right now as a nation. We're terribly divided. There's lots of tremendous infighting. The government is functioning at a very low standard. But hopefully this is an area, particularly when you see this very significant, some would almost say existential economic threat from China, that we can rally around that in this area and preserve our strengths.
Now, Congressman Delaney, I think you bring up a very good point about the need for collaboration and making sure that Americans realize that this issue is one that we all need to come together on. Otherwise, we're going to be basically outcompeted by China. Representative Ferguson, you served on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is broad jurisdiction over things like AI and data privacy, and made significant legislative accomplishments during your tenure. What did you learn about getting things done in a bipartisan way, and how might that help you co-chair the commission?
Well, thanks. And I loved serving on the Energy and Commerce Committee. It was a great committee, not only because of the broad jurisdiction and so many issues that we got to deal with on the committee, but also because traditionally, anyway, historically, it was one of the most bipartisan committees in the Congress. It was, it's the oldest standing committee in the House. It's, going back, traditionally, the chairs and ranking members of the committees worked very, very well together. And it just allowed us to do a lot of things and to get a lot done. And I think John would agree, when you look at historically what the Congress has done, and certainly what the House of Representatives has done, I think some of the best things, the most meaningful things, and the longest lasting things that the House did and that we've done in politics are things that are done in a bipartisan way, things that are that help the institution operate as it was supposed to, and it is supposed to operate, which is with collaboration and trying to build consensus, and bringing folks from different sides of the aisle together to have a say and to be able to participate in the process. I think produces the best fruit, certainly the best legislative fruit, and that is something that I always loved about serving on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and a way that I tried to operate when I was in the House of Representatives. And whether it was, working with then Congressman Patrick Kennedy on trying to increase funding for special education, for instance, something that's very close to my heart, or another issue I worked with then Senator Hillary Clinton to try to develop a respite care program, healthcare program for family caregivers. There's a lot of really meaningful things that I know I can look back on. I'm sure John can say the same, that we worked on that were really meaningful, that really had an impact on people's lives in this country. And those things are going to tend to have been the things that were bipartisan, things where we were able to build consensus across the aisle. And that's, one of the reasons I'm delighted to get to work and to co-chair this bipartisan commission with a friend of mine from across the aisle.
I'm also originally from New Jersey, which will mean that Mike and I are wired to work well together. But
that's right.
Just adding to that, I mean, I agree with everything Mike said. Clearly, the bipartisan solutions produce the most enduring and in many ways the smartest outcomes. And in some of these areas, they're often not the kind of things that get all the headlines. But if we look back at examples of where government policy has actually been transformative in encouraging innovation, you see many, and you see where there could be opportunities here. I mean, we just all celebrated the life of late Senator Dole. He worked on something that I don't think got much attention when he was necessarily doing it, which was the Dole-Buy or the Buy-Dole Act, depending how you frame it. And what this piece of legislation did is it allowed universities who receive government funding for basic research to effectively commercialize that innovation, which prior to this piece of legislation, they weren't allowed to do. There were very significant restrictions. And that single piece of legislation, which again, in the scheme of the kind of the warring headlines we see now coming out of Washington, probably wouldn't have broken through. But that single piece of legislation, in my judgment at least, unleashed what we're now in a 40-year wave of tremendous innovation in life sciences in particular, and also in information technology, because it created a dynamic in these universities where they could take the government funding, invest in the kind of basic research that is hard for the private sector to do because it's so speculative, but is incredibly important to the innovation economy, and take the fruits of that innovation and collaborate with private sector companies and commercialize it. And I think in many ways, that piece of legislation is more responsible for some of the innovation that we've seen in the last 40 years as anything. But it's an example where the government can do things that don't even involve spending a lot of money. I mean, this didn't involve the government spending a lot of money. The government was already spending a lot of money on basic research, and it changed everything. And I think there's similar opportunities here where smart government policy that's really thinking about where there are stumbling blocks in the innovation economy in terms of our global competitiveness can do things to make a big difference. And hopefully our work, which again is going to kick off in Austin in March, hopefully will lead to some ideas that can get acted upon.
Well, I think it's that innovative spirit is the one that we really want to harness. And it's no accident, I don't think, maybe both of you all have connections to New Jersey. I think some of the greatest innovators and minds of science we've known in the last 20 years have come from there. Edison, Einstein was there, and also Buzz Aldrin. So lots of explorers and innovators from the state of New Jersey. But with that same innovative spirit, that same entrepreneurial spirit, Representative Ferguson, there's something to be said for that American entrepreneurial spirit. We've been a land of opportunity and a land of laws. Can you touch on your philosophy on how to balance these principles as we approach AI?
Well, I think part of that, first of all, I really appreciate the commercial for New Jersey. I'm obviously born and raised and loved representing New Jersey in the Congress, and it just so many great things that happen in New Jersey. So thanks for that. I think a lot of this has to do with making sure we're speaking the same language, right? And it is one of the things that I'm hoping that our commission will tackle and get into is, having this common lexicon, having a common language. So we're at least beginning the conversation using the same terms and understanding each other. So many of the misunderstandings that we have in politics today and even in our society today, I think, reflect these divides that we've both referenced here in this conversation. Sometimes we feel like people aren't even using the same terms anymore. We're not even speaking the same language anymore because the words that we're using seem to mean different things. So in a smaller way, I think something that's going to be really important here is for us to be able to have a conversation and kind of define our terms a little bit. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to solicit a lot of input from a lot of stakeholders and from anybody in the public who wants to be a part of this conversation, to share their thoughts, to share their input, so we can have a common language and really understand each other's terms to get into some of this conversation. I think that's going to be a very, very important part of the commission's work, is hearing from as many people as possible, as many stakeholders as possible. I always like to say, the U.S. Congress didn't have a monopoly on good ideas. And certainly our commission will not have a monopoly on good ideas. We need to hear from a lot of people and to get a lot of input.
It was touched on a little bit earlier, Congressman Delaney, about China, and we've also talked a little bit about academia and basic research. In 2017, China took over as the country producing the most peer-reviewed academic research in the U.S., academic research papers on AI, and that continues today. However, I think what's a little bit more concerning that in 2021, China's peer-reviewed articles were more cited than other countries. That means that China really is beginning to lead in this space. What does this mean for the U.S. and our overall competitiveness within the world?
Well, it's obviously a wake-up call. I mean, look, in many ways, China, China's economic ascent, if you will, was based on several things. First, they worked really hard, good for them. Second, they made smart investments, in many ways smarter than we have in the last several decades. I mean, while we don't claim to have an industrial policy, if you look at some of the policies coming out of Washington, we haven't prioritized technological innovation, infrastructure, renewables, which in my judgment are the industries of the future, as much as we should have. And they've actually invested. But the third thing, let's face it, China has done is to get to the position they're in, is in many ways they've acted like pirates and they've stolen things. So the first two things, good for them. The third thing we have to deal with, and we're starting to as a country. So I think it's a wake-up call. But we've had similar wake-up calls in the past. I mean, during the space race, then the former Soviet Union, made some progress that shocked the country and caused us to get our A game in place, if you will. I believe fundamentally we have a better hand than any nation in the world with respect to competing in the innovation economy. Full stop. I would much rather have our hand than anyone else's, including China's. But we've lagged, right? We've lagged in this public-private cooperation that we need. We've lagged, in my judgment, in making some basic investments that we need to do. We've lagged in some ways in allowing some of our dominant, super successful technology companies to get away with some stuff they probably shouldn't have done. Now it's time to get our get our act together and really rise to the challenge, which I totally believe we will. Because again, there's no country better positioned to win in an entrepreneurial, innovative economy than the United States of America. We fundamentally have something that the world wants. Most of the great kind of thinkers in the world would like to actually start their business in the United States still. They'd like to do their research in American universities still. These are singular advantages that we need to make sure we continue to lean into. We've got to focus on our workforce. We got to focus on skills training. We've got to get our immigration policy aligned around this competitive game we're in. We've got to get our basic research investments aligned around this game we're going to win. We've got to have the policies in place to protect our consumers as we launch these very successful and in many ways dominant technology companies. We've got to make sure we have a competitive environment and we don't have monopolistic practices. There's a whole bunch of things we've got to do to make sure we're successful. But we will. But we have to come at it from a sense of optimism, which I think we should. I mean, there's so much pessimism going on in the world right now. And these new innovations are often viewed in a pessimistic light. And it's so unfortunate because the facts really favor the optimist. And if you think about how much better the world has gotten, generally pretty consistently, this pandemic notwithstanding, this tragedy of the pandemic notwithstanding, it's all been because of innovation. I mean, if you look at the condition of the world, the poverty rates, things like that, dramatic improvement over decades because of innovation. And there's every reason to believe this next wave of innovation will bring us the same benefits. But we've got work to do to make sure we compete and to make sure the benefits unfold fairly for all the citizens of our country.
Switching gears from across the Pacific now to across the Atlantic, there's some ongoing discussions now on how artificial intelligence should be regulated. And in some ways, there's a race to regulate AI. The European Union's draft legislative proposal, the AI Act, is currently being worked on, and other countries are continuing to work on regulation. Should the United States follow what others are doing, or should we look to set our own path forward?
Well, I guess I just comment on that by saying I think it's really important to know what others are doing, and I think we should examine that very closely. And I'm hoping that that'll be part of the work of the Commission to really examine how is the EU, how are other countries handling and regulating AI, and because clearly they want to do so in a way that benefits them the greatest and their citizens to the greatest extent possible. It's the same way we should be looking at it. And while I definitely believe that we should chart our own path and our own course here to do what's in the best interests of the United States citizens and consumers and workers, we have to, I think, have our eyes wide open about what others are doing and maybe learn from some of the things that they're doing well or things that may give them an advantage, and think about ways that we need to regulate and handle these issues to make sure that we're doing what's best for the United States. The U.S. is a different and unique country in many, many ways from others around the world. So it's likely that we may be able to have to handle some of these issues in a unique way, a different way than others. But certainly we ought to be learning from them, and we ought to be making sure that as we chart our own path forward, our American path forward, that we know and understand how others around the world are dealing with these issues, because we live in an increasingly global economy. We all have to interact and live with one another. And I think that's probably the most sensible path going forward for our commission.
Now, we've talked a little bit about Europe. We've talked about regulations. Let's bring things home a little bit in terms of some of the domestic issues. We've heard a lot about the potential for AI to harm specific groups of people in the country, particularly those who are minorities and underserved. However, we know that AI can assist in helping people as well rise up from difficult circumstances. AI is furthering credit histories to assist with loans, pinpointing bias and algorithms. With the commission looking at the issue of inclusion, how do we look to develop recommendations around technology that can be both seen in the eyes of some to be a threat, but also a potential positive for society? And I'll throw that to Congressman Delaney.
Well, I think in many ways it can be some of the most important work that we do because, as I said earlier, there are inherent biases in our society. And we have been working hard across the last several decades to eliminate and squeeze out these biases. And so it is incredibly important with this next wave of innovation, where decisions will be made increasingly by machines, but those machines will be programmed, and the intelligence and machine learning inherent in those machines will be programmed ultimately by human beings. And we have to make sure the human beings that are engaged in the programming are considering those biases with respect to the outcomes that their programs produce. And so what's needed in that instance is transparency, so that we understand who's doing the programming, are they reflective of society broadly, and what inputs went into this, and they need to be tested to make sure they're not producing biased results. You brought up a great example in financial services. We know historically there was tremendous discrimination in financial services, particularly racial discrimination. And we've passed laws and we've worked hard to eliminate that. Have we done everything we need to do? No, but we've made progress. Increasingly, financial decisions, loan approval decisions, if you will, credit approval decisions will be made by machines. The nice opportunity is other factors can be now considered, right? Whereas historically, the human beings who are making these credit decisions relied on a very limited set of factors, your credit score, and then you worried that there was individual bias based on their impression of the individual. Going forward, the machines have an opportunity to capture way more information about the person that could reflect that they're a better credit than their underlying credit score indicates, which allows us the pricing of the credit to be lower and effectively opens up the financial services systems to more Americans. That's an amazing step forward in this area. But again, we have to be careful to make sure other biases aren't embedded. So I think this is a place where we can do a lot of work, where we can focus on transparency, because I think that's critical. We can focus on what are the outcomes and making sure that it's producing outcomes that are consistent with the kind of outcomes we want, but also making sure some of these technologies can actually unleash some of the opportunities to level the playing field. And I think that's going to be really exciting. And to some extent, I think it's some of the most important work we're going to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up about, we need to look at the guardrails that might need to be in place, but, the potential opportunities to elevate people as a result of AI and to bring them out of difficult circumstances and really raise up those who have had not been underserved in the financial services sector and other sectors as well, too. But speaking about opportunity, and I think more broadly speaking, we've seen some estimates. PwC has one that says that global GDP could rise by 14% in 2030 due to AI, and this is equivalent of about $15.7 trillion. However, seeing these increases also means that we have to have the correct workforce and the business atmosphere to reach this potential. But with some uncertainty about the future of jobs, how do we guide the Commission's work around preparing the future of the workforce?
Well, I guess I would say, number one, and again, I don't want to get ahead of the work of the Commission. We want to hear from a lot of folks who are expert on so many of these areas, including folks who are expert on the workforce and how AI can have this positive impact on job creation in a fair and inclusive way. I've seen polling that shows that some 2/3 of Americans are optimistic. John was talking before about the importance of optimism here. Some 2/3 of Americans are optimistic that AI can have a positive impact on society. And that, of course, includes especially on the economy and on job creation and on the workforce. I would say for the other third of Americans maybe who are not optimistic, I would say probably some of those folks are folks who maybe don't fully understand the impact that AI can have because it is relatively new or uncertain to them. And I would say maybe some of those folks are folks who maybe feel like they've been already negatively impacted by technology or by artificial intelligence. So I think what's really important as we move forward on the commission is to hear from folks, including those who have concerns about AI, who maybe are concerned about the ethical framework that we can advance artificial intelligence. I think all of those things are going to be really, really important as we try to make sure. I mean, clearly, one of the reasons that we're excited about this commission is because we believe AI can have such a positive impact on our society, on the workforce, on our economy. But the only way that's going to happen is if we have our eyes wide open about what some of the potentially negative impacts are or could be or have been. And I think if we have the most complete information about that, the most input from as many stakeholders as possible and experts who understand these issues, have seen and have experienced some of these issues, I think that will help us to learn, to make recommendations, and to grow in a more positive way, to move in a more positive direction, such that AI can provide the maximum amount of opportunity for our country and for our citizens, and the least amount of negative impact or negative results. And that is in particular on job creation and on our economy.
And just to add to that, the timing of the commission, I think, is particularly good right now, because we hope we're in the later innings of the tragedy of the COVID pandemic, which has caused over 800,000 Americans to lose their lives and impacted families in horrible ways, millions around the world. It has been a catastrophic kind of development for the condition of the world and our own country. But what it has also done is it has accelerated certain trends that were playing out already in our economy. So the transition of the economy to the digital economy was going to unfold over 5 or 6 years. Whatever was going to happen over 5 or 6 years has been accelerated into 1 to 2 years. The trend of more people working remotely was going to play out over 10 years as technologies were adopted. It's been accelerated dramatically because of COVID. You go area after area, what you see is a situation where economic trends that were playing out over a long time and were fairly predictable and created the opportunity for transition, they've all been accelerated because of COVID, which has caused enormous disruption in the economy, created huge opportunities for certain people and certain companies, particularly people with certain skills, and has challenged more profoundly people who were already struggling in many ways. So thinking about how we can accelerate things we need to do in our workforce to prepare it for this transition that has occurred so dramatically because of COVID, I think is incredibly important, and it'll center obviously on technology and the skills workers need for this new economy that we're now in, that again has been accelerated upon us because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Congressman. I think what we've learned today is that AI has a lot of tremendous opportunity, but we also need to ensure that those who have traditionally been left behind are not left behind further, that we're able to compete internationally, and we have a fair system in place for the deployment of this technology. I want to thank both of you all today for your leadership and taking up the roles of co-chairs of this commission. And for those out there watching today, I just want to reemphasize that the commission's first field hearing will be held on March the 10th in Austin, Texas, just before South by Southwest. We will be releasing today, as Congressman Ferguson mentioned, a request for information that will ask basic questions that we're going to seek public comment for regarding things like what is AI, to begin the process of developing a foundation for policy recommendations. You'll find that RFI at our website, AmericanInnovators.com. Once again, thank you again, Congressman Ferguson, Congressman Delaney. Look forward to working with you and solving these issues and getting things done.
Thank you, Jordan.
Great to be with you.